let's dive into section 111. This is the last section of unit number 1. So we've done a lot of fundamentals in unit number 1. The last of which is looking at how to describe the domain and range of a graph, find key elements of a graph, and to create graphs to fit a real-world situation. So those are the 3 things that we'll be tackling throughout this week. So to start, let's remind ourselves a little bit about domain and range. So remember from last week, domain is the input values, which are x values. Range is a set of output values, which are the y. So domain goes with x, range goes with y. So last week, we found the domain from ordered pairs, from tables, and from maps, which are very, very easy to do. All you're doing is just pulling the information off. For a graph, all we really did was plot points on the graph, draw nice little connected dots, and did the vertical line test. So we didn't really do that much with domain and range. That's because domain and range with a graph is a little bit more difficult to do because you have to pay attention to what the graph is. So we're going to spend a lot of this week working on that. And we're going to start with just basic line, either a basic vertical line or a basic horizontal line. We're going to start off very, very simple. So as far as domain and range goes, we're going to look at solid lines, either a standard number line on the x-axis or on the y-axis, or what happens when things are shaded in between. So we have 2 of each of the examples to work themselves through. Of course, as always, if you have questions, please make sure you ask, because closed mouths don't get fed. If you don't open your mouth about it, then you're telling me that you know exactly what you're doing, and you can demonstrate that on a quiz or a test, which both of those are coming up within the next 2 weeks. Chat line is open. So we're going to start with a basic number line. Basic number line going in one direction. So that's similar to examples 1 and 2. So when you have a basic number line, there are 3 things you're going to pay attention to. You're going to pay attention to the point, the number the point is on, what kind of circle is on it, and the direction of the line. So let's look at example 1. So example 1, we have the number -1.5. It has an open circle on it, and it's shading to the left. So it's shading to the left. So we can ask some questions about that. If the line is going to the left, are the numbers getting bigger or smaller? If the line's going to the left, are they getting bigger or smaller? Smaller. They're getting smaller. So numbers smaller. So that tells us something. So that tells us we're going to be using the symbol less than. That tells us we're going to be using less than. Since it's an open circle, -1.5 is not included. So if it was a closed circle, it would be less than or equal to. So that's something that we now have learned. Less than is for open circles. Less than or equal to closed circles. now we know what sign to use. So our domain here would be x is less than negative 1.5. That's your domain. Are you sure? Ain't no but. If you got a question, you gotta ask. Don't just give up on it. So an open circle means you can't include that number. You can't use it. They're giving you a starting point, but you can't use that number. A closed circle means you're starting here and you can use it. Now, what kind of circle it is then dictates what kind of symbol you use. So when you have less than or greater than, that means you can write the number, but you can't use it. So that's why it has an open circle. That's why they would get open circles. You can write the number, you can't use it. If you have less than or equal to, that means it's either less than that number or it's equal to that number. When that situation happens, you would have a closed circle. A closed circle means you have the number and you can use that. Same thing for greater than or equal to. Now the reason we use negative 1.5, that's the number they gave us. Why is the x there? Because we don't know what number you're going to pick. So since we don't know what number we could pick, we use x to represent whatever we want. Does that help clarify? Well, if it doesn't, that's fine. We have another example that we're going to do with it. But I appreciate the fact that you're asking, because I'm pretty sure someone else has the same question but aren't bringing it up. Remember, folks, closed mouths don't get fed. Don't wait and hope that someone else is going to ask that question, because if they don't, then that's on you. If it's a closed circle, then you can use the number. And that's going to tell you what kind of sign to use. So let's look at example 2. So for example 2, we have a closed dot on the number 2, and it's pointing, the shading is to the right. So what are all the numbers to the right of 2? Is that bigger numbers or smaller numbers? So these are bigger numbers. So bigger numbers is an indicator of greater. When you have bigger numbers, that's indicating greater than or greater than or equal to. Which one we use depends on the circle that you have. Depends on what that circle was. Since it's a closed circle, that means it's either equal to 2 or it's greater than 2. So you would use greater than or equal to. And there's your domain. So for example 2, that's your domain. Any questions, examples 1 or 2? I know Amari will ask if he has any questions, because he doesn't want to be left out there hanging. Alright. Now, if you're starting now, examples 3 and 4 are, well, what do we do if the shading is in between? Example 1, the shading was going to the left. Example 2, the shading was going to the right. Examples 3 and 4, well, what do you do if it's in between two numbers? What do we do if it's in between two numbers? So let's start with example 3. So if it's in between two numbers, you have to start from one number, go from left to right, and then go to the other number and go back in the other direction. So if I start from 0, the shading is going to the right. If I go to the right, is that greater than or less than? That's greater. So I have x is greater than or equal to, because it's a closed circle, 0. That's if I'm starting from 0. What if I was starting at 6? If I'm starting at 6, which way is the shading going? Which way does the shading go? If I'm starting from 6 to the left. If I'm going to the left, is that less than or greater than? That's less than. So if I start from 6, then it's less than 6. So since I have two numbers, I have two parts. So both of those are my answers. X is greater than or equal to 0, and x is less than 6. So I have both answers. Why do I have two answers? Because I have dots on two numbers. So I have to account for them both. Now this is the long way of giving that answer. Now if you wanted a shorter way to write it, then you would take the two numbers, put the variable in the middle, and then use less than or equal to or less than signs. So this is the short way to write it. They mean the same thing. That's just a short way to write it. If you don't want to write it the short way, that's fine. No one's going to be mad at you for that. That's the short way to write it. questions with example 3? Yeah, if you're stuck, gotta say something. I don't know that you're stuck. I can't read your mind. If I could read your mind, I'm going to play a lottery. Win about $20 million. But, let's see, how do we get this answer? Okay, well, which part? I'm definitely glad that you're asking, but, the short way? So, to get the short way answer, notice that all the numbers are in between. We want all the numbers in between. So, if x is greater than or equal to 0, you're going this way. If x is less than 6, you're going in the other direction. Notice that they're overlapping. We use less than signs to indicate overlap. We use less than signs to indicate overlap.
Question.
Uh-huh.
So you said this. Okay, so open circle means you cannot use the number.
You cannot use that. You can't plug that number in. You can use it to represent the answer, but you can't plug the number in. So if we had a problem like 4x plus 6, that means I can't plug in 6. Good question. Tyler, and I hope I answered your question about how to get the short way. Any other questions before we do example 4? Example 4. So example 4 is just like example 3. Example 4 is just like example 3. So we start from -8 and go to the right. So if we go to the right, is that less than or greater than?
Greater.
That's greater than. So x is greater than -8. So that's an open circle, so you can't put equal to. Circle has to be closed to put equal. And we have 6. So 6 has to go in the other direction. So if I go to the left, is that less than or greater than? So x less than or equal to 6. Now we can put equal to because the circle was closed.
So if it lets you, but not close, are you always not letting you close?
That's correct. That is correct. So anytime you see a closed circle, that means it's equal to. So it's less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. Open circle is less than or greater than without the line underneath. So that's your domain. That's the long way to write it. Again, short way to write it. Take a smaller number, larger number, put x in the middle, and then use the appropriate sign. So if you're writing it the short way, you only use less than signs. You don't use greater than signs. use less than signs because they point from left to right. Greater than signs point the other direction. Question 3 or 4. Okay, let's look at the last two examples we'll look at involve you have a graph, but you're only going in one direction. You have a graph, you're going in one direction. So if you have a graph, x-axis, y-axis. So remember, on the x-axis, to the right are all your positive numbers. To the left, all your negative numbers. On the y-axis, up above are all your positives, and below are your negatives. So, which sign you use depends on which way the graph is pointing. So for example 5, first thing, am I on the x-axis or the y-axis? I'm on the y-axis. So I'm going to use y as the variable. Am I pointing up or am I pointing down? Up. So since I'm pointing up, that means I'm either going to use greater than or greater than or equal to. So look at the dot. Is that open or closed? That's open. So remember, greater than is open. Greater than or equal to is closed. So y is greater than 2. Y is greater than 2. And that's your range because you are on the y-axis. That's your range because you was on the y-axis. Again, range goes up and down. Domain goes left to right. Range goes up and down. Domain goes left to right. Any questions on example 5? All right. Let's do example 6, and then we'll summarize some stuff as we prepare to go into Wednesday. So, example 6, same rules apply. Are we on the x-axis or the y-axis? Where's our graph? All right. So we're on the x-axis, so this is going to be a domain. Are we going to the left or right? Is our graph going to the left or going to the right? Graph is going to the right. So that means it's greater than or greater than or equal to. What kind of circle is on it? This is closed, so we're going to use greater than or equal to. And the number it was on was 3. There's your domain. That's your domain, and that's it. Any questions before we summarize the main parts? So the main parts, or the parts that I've noticed are the harder parts. So the harder parts is, when do you use a less than or just greater than? When you have an open circle. You use less than or equal to and greater than or equal to when you have a closed circle. Domain is for x-axis, going from left to right. Your range is for the y-axis, going up and down. Now, we didn't do a lot going up and down, so we'll do a lot more of that on Wednesday. And then, if you're shading in between, so if you're shading in between, you have two parts. Your first part is if you're going from left to right. The second part is if you're going from right to left. Or you can write it as a shortcut. Small number, x, big number, and then the less than signs in between. So that's the short way. It doesn't matter which way you get the answer. If you want to write it the long way, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. So, any questions before we get ready to transition out?